They shot down his P-51 on the afternoon of November 2nd, 1944, somewhere over occupied Czechoslovakia. The Mustang went down in a ball of fire and smoke, spiraling toward the frozen fields below, while its pilot hung motionless in his harness, watching the ground rush up through a haze of anti-aircraft bursts and fighter smoke. Captain Bruce Carr had been one of the most successful fighter pilots in the European theater, a man whose name German intelligence had learned to fear, a man who had survived 170 combat missions when most pilots were rotated home after 50. But on this mission, luck ran out. A direct flak hit his engine, sent his propeller spinning into the sky like a falling star, left him with nothing but a dying aircraft and a choice: die in the burning wreck or jump. Carr jumped. He landed hard in a snow-covered field outside a small Czech village, his parachute catching the wind and dragging him toward a line of bare trees before he could cut the cords. His leg was broken from the impact of the bailout, his ribs bruised from the slamming descent, his face bloodied where flak fragments had found his flesh during the fall. He buried his parachute in a snowdrift, fashioned a crude splint for his leg from broken branches and torn shirt fabric, and began the long crawl toward cover. The Germans would be looking for him. They always looked for the P-51 pilots, the ones who flew over their cities and burned their factories and lived to fly back another day. A high-value target had fallen into their territory. They would not rest until they had him. Carr spent 3 days evading through the Czech countryside, moving at night when the German patrols withdrew to their warm barracks, hiding in barns and forest hollows during the day when the cold wind carried the sound of footsteps through the bare branches. He survived on snow and whatever food honest Czech farmers could sneak into his hiding places without their German overseers knowing. The farmers knew what he was. They could see the American eagles on the buttons he hadn't had time to tear from his flight jacket, could hear the broken English when he whispered his thanks for the bread they pressed into his hands. They helped him anyway, because the Americans were coming. Everyone knew that now, and the Germans were a defeated army pretending still to be strong. These farmers took that risk for a man they would never see again, a stranger who might or might not survive to tell their kindness to anyone. On the third night, Carr's leg so swollen he could barely crawl, his body shivering with cold and exhaustion, he made his way to a hill overlooking a German airfield. He had heard the farmers talk about it, this place where the Luftwaffe kept its remaining fighters, these precious machines that the Germans wheeling and guarding like treasure. From his vantage point in the frozen trees, Carr watched the runway lights come on at dusk, watched German mechanics push sleek Focke-Wulf 190 fighters into their revetments, watched ground crews fuel and arm the aircraft for the next day's patrols. One aircraft sat at the end of the runway, alone and ready, its engine warmed periodically by a ground crew that clearly expected nothing to go wrong. The war was going badly for Germany, but they still trusted their own territory. They still believed they were safe from the men they had driven from the sky. Carr spent 3 days evading through the Czech countryside, moving at night when the German patrols withdrew to their warm barracks, hiding in barns and forest hollows during the day when the cold wind carried the sound of footsteps through the bare branches. He survived on snow and whatever food honest Czech farmers could sneak into his hiding places without their German overseers knowing. The farmers knew what he was. They could see the American eagles on the buttons he hadn't had time to tear from his flight jacket, could hear the broken English when he whispered his thanks for the bread they pressed into his hands. They helped him anyway, because the Americans were coming. Everyone knew that now, and the Germans were a defeated army pretending still to be strong. These farmers took that risk for a man they would never see again, a stranger who might or might not survive to tell their kindness to anyone. On the third night, Carr's legs so swollen he could barely crawl, his body shivering with cold and exhaustion. He made his way to a hill overlooking a German airfield. He had heard the farmers talk about it, this place where the Luftwaffe kept its remaining fighters, these precious machines that the Germans wheeling and guarding like treasure. From his vantage point in the frozen trees, Carr watched the runway lights come on at dusk, watched German mechanics push sleek Focke-Wulf 190 fighters into their revetments, watched ground crews fuel and arm the aircraft for the next day's patrols. One aircraft sat at the end of the runway, alone and ready, its engine warmed periodically by a ground crew that clearly expected nothing to go wrong. The war was going badly for Germany, but they still trusted their own territory. They still believed they were safe from the men they had driven from the sky. Carr waited until the early hours of the morning, until the airfield fell silent except for the rumble of generators and the distant voices of guards making their rounds. He made his way down the hillside on his unbroken arm and his good leg, dragging himself through frozen mud and snow until he reached the perimeter fence. The fence was nothing, a few strands of wire that he cut with his pocket knife, the gaps hidden by shadows and the carelessness of guards who believed the war was far from here. He reached the Focke-Wulf 190 and stood for a moment in its shadow, hardly believing what he was about to do. He had never flown a German aircraft. He had never even sat in one. But aircraft were aircraft. The stick was the stick. The throttle was the throttle. The principles of flight did not change because the roundels on the wing were black instead of American red. He climbed into the cockpit. The German instruments were marked in unfamiliar ways, the controls in slightly different places than he was used to, the whole cockpit laid out in that distinctly German way that prioritized function over the comfort of American hands. Carr spent the remaining hours of darkness studying every switch, every gauge, every lever. He learned which one started the engine. He learned which one controlled the landing gear. He learned which ones fired the guns, and which ones did something he would never need to know. By the time the first gray light of dawn crept over the eastern horizon, he had the Focke-Wulf 190 systems memorized as thoroughly as he knew his own Mustang. And when the duty pilot came walking out to begin his pre-flight checks, Carr was already in the cockpit with the engine running. What happened next became the stuff of legend, the story that fighter pilots would tell in bars from London to Los Angeles for generations to come. Carr taxied the Focke-Wulf 190 onto the runway, his hands learning the aircraft's strange responses, his feet finding pedals that worked in the wrong direction from what he was used to. The Germans on the ground began to shout, to run toward the departing fighter, but it was too late. Carr opened the throttle, and the aircraft surged forward, building speed down the concrete strip, lifting off at the very end in a climb so steep that he nearly stalled before gaining enough speed to level out. He was in the air. He was flying a stolen German aircraft over Nazi-occupied territory, and the only thing between him and certain death was 200 miles of hostile airspace and whatever skill he had accumulated in 15 years of flying. He flew at treetop level, hugging the ground where German radar could not find him and German fighters could not catch him, skimming over frozen fields and bare forests in an aircraft that every German on the ground must have recognized as their own. American pilots would see him coming and wonder how a German fighter had gotten so far behind their lines. German pilots would see him and wonder why their comrade was flying so low, so fast, so deliberately away from the front. Carr flew through the morning light, his broken leg throbbing in the cockpit, his eyes scanning the sky for threats that never quite materialized, his hands working the controls of an enemy aircraft as if it were his own. The stolen Focke-Wulf 190 responded to his touch, carried him over mountains and rivers, brought him closer with every passing minute to the Allied lines that meant freedom. He reached American-held territory around midday, the change visible in the attitudes of people below. Heads that had been turned away from aircraft now lifted in hope. Hands that had been hidden now waving. Faces that had been fearful now breaking into smiles. Carr circled once over what he recognized as an American forward airfield, banked low over the runway to announce his presence, and began his final approach. But the Focke-Wulf 190 had one secret that Carr had not learned in his night of study. The landing gear lever, the one that should have lowered the wheels for a proper touchdown, did nothing when he pulled it. The hydraulic system that powered the landing gear had been designed with a German pilot's knowledge of its quirks, a second lever that redirected pressure when the main system failed. Carr did not know about the second lever. He did not know that the aircraft he had stolen could not lower its wheels with any lever he had tried. He made the only choice left to him. He belly-landed the Focke-Wulf 190 on the frozen grass beside the runway, sliding for 300 yards in a shower of frozen earth and broken prop before coming to rest in a smoking heap at the edge of the field. And as the American ground troops came running toward the wreck, rifles raised, faces hard with the expectation of finding a dead German pilot, they heard a voice from inside the cockpit that stopped them cold. The voice was American, it was angry, and it has been quoted ever since with varying degrees of accuracy and profanity. Something along the lines of, "Don't shoot, you fools, I'm Captain Carr of this goddamned squadron, and I flew this thing all the way from Czechoslovakia." The men who pulled him from the wreckage could not believe what they were hearing. Captain Bruce Carr had been listed as missing in action for 3 days. His P-51 had been found burned to a husk in a Czechoslovakian field, its pilot presumed dead or captured. And here he was, alive, smiling through blood and bruises, standing beside the wreckage of a German fighter that he claimed to have stolen from right under the Germans' noses. The story spread through the squadron like wildfire, then through the division, then through the entire 9th Air Force. Within a week, everyone in the American forces in Europe had heard of the pilot who refused to be captured, who had stolen a German fighter from its own airfield, who had flown 200 miles through enemy territory in an aircraft whose controls he barely understood. The story grew with every telling. Some of the details may have changed, the distance, the date, the exact words spoken at the crash landing, but the essence remained. One American pilot, faced with capture or death, chose a third option that no one had ever considered before. Bruce Carr went on to become one of the most decorated fighter pilots of the war. He finished with 15 confirmed aerial victories, a Distinguished Service Cross, a Silver Star, and enough other medals to weigh down a sack. He flew 172 combat missions when the average was 50, survived 2 more forced landings behind enemy lines, and lived to see the end of the war in Europe and then keep flying in Korea and Vietnam. But when people asked him about his service, when journalists and historians came calling for the story that had made him famous, he would smile and change the subject. He did not like to talk about the stolen Focke-Wulf 190, not because he was modest, fighter pilots are rarely modest, but because the truth was more complicated than the legend. The official record shows no missing aircrew report for the November 2nd mission. There is no evasion report in the files. The 354th Fighter Group's unit histories make no mention of a pilot stolen away over Czechoslovakia, of a stolen German aircraft, of a belly landing at a forward airfield. What the records do show is that Carr flew numerous missions in the final months of the war, that he continued to add to his tally of victories, that he survived the war without ever being listed as missing in action. The story of the stolen Focke-Wulf 190, it seems, may have been a bar story that grew in the telling, a tale told in the officers' clubs of England and France that took on a life of its own. Or perhaps the mission did happen, but the paperwork was lost, the reports filed incorrectly, the whole affair classified and forgotten in the chaos of advancing armies and collapsing regimes. What we know for certain is that Bruce Carr was an extraordinary pilot, one of the best the American forces produced in the European theater. We know that he flew more missions than any sane man should have volunteered for, that he led formations against impossible odds and came home victorious, that he earned every medal that was pinned to his chest. We know that he flew German aircraft at various points in his career, both for testing purposes and for the sheer joy of flying machines that other men feared. And we know that somewhere in the archives of the United States Air Force, or in the memories of the men who served with him, there is a story that has never quite been told straight. Whether he actually stole a Focke-Wulf 190 from a Czechoslovakian airfield and flew it home may never be definitively proven. But the story persists because it captures something essential about the men who flew fighter aircraft in World War II. They were not ordinary soldiers. They did not think like ordinary soldiers. And when faced with the choice between capture and death, some of them, perhaps only a few, perhaps only one, chose a third option that made no logical sense, but felt absolutely right. Bruce Carr died in 1998, buried at Arlington National Cemetery with full military honors. His grave bears the simple inscription of an Air Force colonel, a decorated veteran, a man who served his country for 30 years in 3 different wars. The grave does not mention the stolen Focke-Wulf 190. It does not mention the 3 days of evasion in Czechoslovakia, or the famous words spoken to American troops who nearly shot him down. Those details are left to the stories that survive in the memories of the men who knew him, in the bars where fighter pilots still gather to trade tales of glory and terror, in the endless mythology that has grown up around the men who flew the P-51 Mustang over Nazi Europe. Whether the story is true in every detail may not matter as much as the fact that people still want to hear it. It reminds us that war produces moments of impossible courage, that men can refuse to accept the fate that circumstances seem to demand, and that the line between the possible and the impossible is drawn by the imagination of the man who faces it. Bruce Carr faced that line on November 2, 1944, and drew it somewhere else.